World War II demanded an unprecedented shipbuilding effort from the United States. The Escort carrier, officially designated CVE, was a product of this industrial necessity. It was a small, slow, and lightly protected vessel hastily converted from a merchant tanker or a freighter hull. These diminutive carriers were derisively nicknamed Jeep carriers by their own crews and often combustible, vulnerable, expendable by those who served on larger ships. Japanese naval commanders, steeped in the doctrine of the decisive fleet battle, viewed these tiny ships with open contempt. They saw them as irrelevant, a footnote to the true power of naval air warfare embodied by their magnificent fleet carriers. The Japanese Imperial Navy possessed some of the most formidable battleships and heavy cruisers ever built, ships designed for crushing power and endurance. Their initial assessment of the American escort carriers was that they were glorified transports, certainly no match for a true battle group. This hubris, however, was a fatal miscalculation that would cost them dearly. They failed to grasp the strategic flexibility and, more importantly, the sheer ubiquity that these cheap, mass-produced carriers brought to the war. The Allies used the CVEs as tools of attrition, not as main battle line units. They provided air cover where it was desperately needed but never expected. This documentary tells the story of how that mockery turned to terror. It is the story of a small group of expendable ships who faced down the greatest surface fleet ever assembled. The sheer audacity of their defense would permanently alter the Japanese High Command's perception of American naval power. The battle off Samar remains a testament to the fact that courage and tactical aggression can often triumph over overwhelming firepower. The Jeep carriers were about to earn a new, terrifying nickname from the enemy, the killer convoys. Their humble beginnings belied the incredible fighting spirit that defined their final stand. The escort carrier concept was born out of a desperate need to combat the German U-boat menace in the unforgiving North Atlantic. Supply lines across the ocean were being savaged by German wolf packs with alarming regularity. Convoys were slow, cumbersome, and incredibly vulnerable once they passed beyond the range of land-based air cover. The US and British navies realized they needed to bring the air cover to the convoys themselves. Building massive fleet carriers took too long and required too many resources to meet the immediate crisis. The solution was a pragmatic, ingenious compromise: the conversion of existing commercial ship hulls. Specifically, the sturdy T-2 tanker hull and others were chosen for their availability and ease of modification. These ships could be produced in astounding numbers and at a fraction of the cost of a full-sized carrier. American shipyards, operating at a wartime frenzy, churned out these escort carriers with remarkable speed. The flight decks were minimal, the engines often slow, and the armor protection was barely sufficient. Their operational doctrine was simple: launch small anti-submarine and fighter patrols to protect the valuable cargo ships below. They were literally floating air bases designed for defense and surveillance, not offensive power projection. These ships were crewed by a mix of veteran sailors and newly minted reserves, all committed to the thankless task of protecting the lifeline to Europe. The escort carrier represented the triumph of mass production and tactical specialization over the classic ideal of naval might. They were the workhorses of the fleet, unglamorous but absolutely vital to the Allied war effort. Without the endless stream of supplies that they protected, the entire war effort in Europe would have collapsed. Their design dictated a fundamental change in naval warfare, prioritizing logistics and protection above all else. This humble beginning would serve as the foundation for the ship's most incredible moment later in the war. The escort carrier's value was first proven definitively in the brutal, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of attrition, fought not for territory, but for sustenance and survival. German U-boats were devastating the Allied merchant fleet, threatening to choke Britain into submission. The arrival of the CVEs dramatically changed the equation for the U-boat wolf packs. Now, a convoy was no longer a defenseless target once it left the coastal air umbrella. The presence of a jeep carrier meant that anti-submarine aircraft could patrol continuously, day and night. These small aircraft, often equipped with primitive radar, could pinpoint a surfaced U-boat attempting a night attack. The planes would then coordinate attacks with the escorting destroyers and frigates. This synergy between surface ships and air power became a lethal combination for Admiral Donnett's submarine fleet. U-boat commanders quickly realized that the odds of survival had plummeted dramatically. The hunters were now often the hunted, trapped between aggressive aircraft above and determined destroyers below. Escort carriers like the USS Bogue became famous for their high kill counts against German submarines. They created highly effective hunter-killer groups, whose sole purpose was to actively seek out and destroy the wolf packs. The tide of the Atlantic War began to decisively turn in the Allies' favor once the escort carriers were deployed in force. The cheap, expendable ships proved to be the perfect counterweapon to the expensive and deadly submarines. Their success was a clear validation of the design philosophy that favored quantity and specialized function. The lessons learned in the choppy, cold waters of the Atlantic were invaluable for the coming battles in the Pacific. It was here that the escort carrier truly shed its mocking nickname and became an indispensable tool of war. Their proven effectiveness against one formidable enemy set the stage for their confrontation with another. As the war in Europe stabilized, the United States turned its full industrial might toward the Pacific theater. The escort carriers, now battle-hardened and numerous, were rapidly deployed to this new, sprawling ocean. In the Pacific, their primary role shifted slightly, moving from pure anti-submarine warfare to a critical support function. They became the mobile airfields essential for supporting amphibious operations across the vast expanse of the ocean. Their aircraft provided close air support for the Marines and Army troops fighting for control of fortified islands. The CVEs would launch fighters to establish air superiority over a landing zone before the larger fleet carriers could safely arrive. They also transported replacement aircraft and supplies, acting as floating logistical hubs. Their ability to operate in smaller numbers and shallower waters made them perfect for island-hopping campaigns. While they lacked the striking power and high speed of a Lexington-class or Essex-class carrier, their flexibility was unmatched. They could be tasked with the less glamorous but absolutely necessary duties that kept the entire war machine moving forward. The mere sight of a jeep carrier meant that supplies, reinforcements, or an emergency air strike were close at hand for isolated troops. This continuous presence stretched the Japanese defenses thin and helped maintain the relentless pace of the American advance. Japanese intelligence noted the widespread use of these carriers but continued to underestimate their combat value. They saw them as primarily defensive platforms, incapable of engaging their powerful main body fleet. This was an understandable conclusion given the escort carriers' specifications and their historical deployment patterns. However, the CVE air groups were composed of highly trained pilots ready to fight any enemy with whatever aircraft they possessed. The pilot's skill and ferocity were independent of the ship's size or speed. This tactical readiness, combined with the ship's sheer presence, would soon lead to an unimaginable confrontation. The Japanese Imperial Navy entered World War II with a profound confidence built on years of rigorous training and early victories. Their doctrine centered on the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle, where a powerful, concentrated fleet would obliterate the enemy. At the core of this fleet were the world's largest and most powerful battleships, the Yamato and Musashi. These behemoths, with their 18.1-inch guns, represented the absolute zenith of naval engineering. The heavy cruisers, such as the Tone and the Chikuma, were fast, heavily armed, and capable of delivering devastating blows. Their commanders, like Admiral Tokeo Kurita, were aggressive and believed absolutely in the superiority of their ships. They considered the American fleet to be a collection of lesser, more hastily built vessels. The very idea of a CVE, a converted merchant ship, engaging their battle line was a laughable absurdity to them. In their strategic calculations, the escort carrier was dismissed as a viable threat to their battle group. They focused their efforts on destroying the Essex-class fleet carriers, the true symbols of American naval power. The Japanese sailors and officers were highly disciplined and expected to fight to the death to achieve victory. This ingrained honor code and fighting spirit made them formidable and terrifying opponents. Even after devastating losses at Midway and in the Solomons, the remaining Japanese fleet was a potent fighting force. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would represent their final, desperate throw of the dice to turn the tide of the war. Their plan was an intricate, highly complex operation designed to trap and destroy the American invasion fleet. It relied on the distraction of the American main carriers, allowing the powerful center force to slip through and savage the landing ships. Admiral Kurita's command of the center force included battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, a force intended to crush anything in its path. He fully expected a straightforward engagement with supply ships and perhaps a few token escorts. The idea that a handful of jeep carriers could stand against this array of steel was literally beneath their consideration. The stage for the legendary stand of the escort carriers was set during the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The United States was launching a critical invasion of the Philippines, aiming to cut off Japan's resource lifeline. The Japanese command developed a complex, four-pronged counterattack known as Operation Shogo, or Victory Operation. The main objective was to smash the huge American invasion force gathered in Leyte Gulf. This plan utilized a decoy force of carriers to lure away Admiral Halsey's powerful U.S. Third Fleet north of the Philippines. Once the decoy worked, Admiral Kurita's mighty center force would steam through the San Bernardino Strait. The final two forces were smaller and aimed at the southern approaches, but Kurita's was the hammer blow. On the American side, the immense Seventh Fleet, commanded by Admiral Kinkaid, was tasked with protecting the landing forces. The Seventh Fleet's air power was primarily provided by 18 small escort carriers, divided into 3 task units, known collectively as ITAFI 1, 2, and 3. These TAFI groups were spread out, providing anti-submarine patrol and close air support for the troops already ashore. They were not intended for a surface engagement with heavy enemy warships. They were lightly armed, their fastest speed barely exceeding the speed of the slowest Japanese cruisers. The largest guns on a CVE were a handful of 5-inch pieces, utterly ineffective against battleship armor. Their crews were confident in their ability to fight enemy aircraft and submarines, but not a full battle line. When Admiral Halsey took the bait and chased the decoy carriers, he left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. This fatal miscommunication and tactical error left the 6 CVEs and 7 escorts of Task Unit 3 April, 77, or Taffy 3, as the only thing between Curator's center force and the Leyte landing beach. The vulnerability of the American forces was immense, and the Japanese trap was sprung perfectly. Taffy 3, the sacrificial lamb of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers, led by his flagship, the USS Fanshawe Bay. The entire battle group was protected by a meager screen of 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. The total combat power of Taffy 3 was negligible compared to the force it was about to encounter. The destroyers were relics of the Great Depression, while the destroyer escorts were even smaller, built primarily for anti-submarine work. Their mission, as they understood it, was to fly air patrols and support the troops fighting ashore in Leyte. On the morning of October 25, 1944, Taffy 3 was steaming calmly off the island of Samar, completely unaware of the approaching danger. Suddenly, radar operators detected massive surface contacts appearing on their scopes to the northwest. These contacts were quickly identified as the main body of the Japanese center force, led by Admiral Tokyo Kurita. Kurita's fleet included the battleship Yamato, 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and several light cruisers and destroyers. The disparity in firepower and armor was the greatest in any modern naval engagement. It was a confrontation between a small, defensive convoy and a concentrated, offensive battle line. Admiral Sprague's immediate reaction, broadcast across the fleet, was an expression of disbelief at the impossible odds. He knew instantly that his primary goal had switched from support to desperate survival. His orders were simple: lay smoke, run for the nearest rain squall, and launch every single aircraft available. The small ships prepared for a battle they could not possibly win, yet they prepared to fight it anyway. The crews understood their expendable nature, but they would not go quietly into the morning sea. The opening moments of the battle off Samar were a terrifying spectacle of overwhelming naval power. At dawn, Kurita's center force opened fire, the first salvos of 18.1-inch shells from the Yamato screaming toward the tiny American carriers. The Japanese ships were initially confused, believing they had stumbled upon a major component of Halsey's fleet. The American escort carriers were quickly enveloped by huge geysers of water as the massive shells began to fall around them. Admiral Sprague ordered a desperate, maximum-speed retreat eastward, heading straight into the wind to launch planes. The CVEs, built for cargo speed, shuddered under the strain of being pushed far beyond their design limits. The accompanying destroyers and destroyer escorts immediately began the crucial task of laying a thick, black smoke screen. This smoke, combined with the low morning visibility, was the only thing offering the carriers a momentary shield. The destroyers, knowing their fate, were ordered to charge the Japanese battle line. This was not a tactical maneuver, it was an act of suicidal, heroic defiance to buy the carriers time. The Japanese ships were caught off guard by the sheer aggression of these tiny escorts. The heavy cruiser Kumano was hit by a torpedo from the destroyer USS Johnston early in the engagement, crippling her bow. This shocking, unexpected damage momentarily threw the Japanese battle formation into disarray. Kurita's commanders, anticipating a panicked retreat, were instead met with ferocious, organized counterattacks. The battle instantly devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters slugfest as the massive Japanese ships attempted to chase down the fleeing carriers. The CVEs launched every plane they had, armed with whatever ordnance was immediately available. The small American escorts fought with a suicidal valor that remains one of the great epics of naval history. The USS Johnston, a heavily damaged destroyer, turned back into the fight after firing its first torpedoes. Its captain, Commander Ernest Evans, pressed the attack, dueling with Japanese heavy cruisers at point-blank range. The Johnston was eventually sunk, but not before inflicting significant damage and absorbing enemy fire intended for the carriers. The destroyer USS Hull charged directly at the Yamato, firing its small 5-inch guns at the massive superstructure. Its crew knew they were signing their death warrants, but their sacrifice was absolutely necessary for the greater good. The even smaller destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, was nicknamed a destroyer anything but escort by its crew. It closed the distance to a Japanese heavy cruiser and fired its torpedoes before engaging in a gun duel. The Samuel B. Roberts was pulverized by enemy fire, but its final, desperate message was, "We are retreating at full speed toward the enemy." Meanwhile, the escort carrier air groups, despite their limited anti-ship ordnance, were relentlessly attacking. They dropped fragmentation bombs, depth charges, and even dummy runs to create maximum confusion. The sheer volume of air attacks, however ineffective the weapons were, convinced the Japanese they were facing a much larger carrier force. Pilots were forced to rearm quickly on the CVEs, often landing, taking on any available bomb or rocket, and taking off again within minutes. This combined surface and air onslaught was a textbook example of a desperate, unified defense. The bravery of these few ships stalled and distracted a force that should have swept them aside in minutes. The air attacks launched from the 6 small escort carriers were a masterpiece of improvisation and controlled chaos. The pilots' primary goal was not to sink the massive Japanese warships but to disrupt their fire control and sow panic. They took off with incredible speed, often forced to use torpedoes and bombs intended for submarines and ground targets. Some aircraft were loaded with depth charges, which were completely useless against heavy cruiser armor, but they dropped them anyway. The pilots pressed their attacks, diving low and strafing the bridges of the Japanese battleships and cruisers. They focused on causing splash damage and near misses, obscuring the view of the Japanese gunners. The sheer, continuous presence of American aircraft convinced the Japanese that a massive, undisclosed carrier fleet was operating nearby. A few lucky hits, particularly against the lightly armored topsides of the Japanese vessels, did inflict significant damage. The heavy cruiser Chikuma was repeatedly struck and eventually sank due to the concentrated efforts of the air groups. The constant attacks forced Admiral Kurita's formation to break up as ships peeled off to deal with the incoming planes. The smooth, coordinated battle line dissolved into individual ships maneuvering wildly to evade air attacks. This tactical anarchy was exactly what the American forces desperately needed to survive. The escort carrier planes, flying in repeated waves until they were nearly out of fuel, were the phantom fleet that saved the day. Their audacity and disregard for their own safety prevented the Japanese from concentrating their fire on the fleeing carriers. This was the moment when the Jeep carrier air groups earned the respect they had always deserved. They used their limited resources with devastating effect, turning a certain rout into a confused, desperate melee. The decision to retreat by Admiral Takeo Kurita remains one of the most debated moments in World War II history. Kurita's battle formation was a shambles, scattered by the relentless attacks of the small American escorts and aircraft. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers, and his ships were low on fuel and exposed to what he perceived as a major American carrier group. The constant, swarming air attacks had completely convinced him that he was not facing jeep carriers but the main U.S. Third Fleet. He had received confusing reports about other Japanese forces being defeated elsewhere in the vast battle. A growing sense of isolation and uncertainty began to cloud his strategic judgment. Kurita knew that if he continued toward Leyte Gulf, his fleet would be vulnerable to endless air attack from this main carrier force. He was unaware that his enemy was merely 6 small escort carriers that were nearly out of ammunition and fuel. After fighting for nearly 4 hours, Kurita abruptly ordered his remaining center force to break off the engagement and head north. He chose to preserve his remaining battleships for a later, decisive engagement that never materialized. This single order saved the entire American invasion force gathered at Leyte Gulf. If Kurita had continued his attack for just 1 more hour, he would have reached the completely unprotected landing ships. His retreat was a monumental strategic error, born entirely from the effective illusion created by the escort carriers. The mockery of the jeep carrier had been replaced by the fear of the killer convoy. The psychological impact of the continuous air attacks was more damaging than the actual physical hits they scored. Kurita failed to recognize the incredible vulnerability of his opponent and paid the price in a monumental withdrawal. The Battle off Samar was a tactical defeat for Taffy III, which lost 2 carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. However, strategically, it was an immeasurable victory that turned the entire tide of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The killer convoy had successfully prevented the destruction of the American invasion fleet. The escort carrier had finally earned its respect, shedding all vestiges of its mocker scorn. Their crews, from the pilots to the engineers, had performed a feat of arms that defied all logical military calculus. The destroyer and destroyer escort crews became immediate legends for their selfless, almost unbelievable charge against the battleship line. Their actions are studied today as the ultimate example of tenacity and initiative in the face of overwhelming odds. The CVEs continued to serve throughout the rest of the Pacific War, providing essential support for nearly every major operation. They were critical in bringing the war to an end, demonstrating that a small ship, when properly utilized, could be as strategically vital as a large one. The legacy of the escort carrier is one of necessity, ingenuity, and a refusal to acknowledge their own limitations. They proved that massive size and powerful guns do not guarantee victory against a determined, aggressive defense. The Japanese commanders who had once scoffed at these jeep carriers learned a harsh and unforgettable lesson. They discovered that a small, fast, and expendable ship could become a relentless, deadly opponent. The killer convoys were not an aberration but a testament to the fighting spirit of the American Navy. The humble escort carrier, forged in the Atlantic and baptized in fire off Samar, stands as an eternal symbol of victory through sheer will. This epic struggle solidified the escort carrier's place as one of the most consequential ships of World War II. Their role was simple, but their impact was absolutely profound.